Good. Hi, everybody. I'm Matt. Hi, Katrine. We're live.
Hi, Pascal. Hi, Matt. We're live. Welcome, everyone, to this 10th episode of Piece of the Puzzle. We are here with Matt Waldman to discuss his paper, Peacemaking in Trouble. And we're really excited to have him join us today. Matt and Pascal, where do I both find you at the moment? Where are you right now, and what time is it where you are?
I'm in Yorkshire in the UK, and it's sort of mid-afternoon.
Okay. Welcome again, and thank you for making the time.
Hi.
A pleasure.
So I'm in the hospital. It wasn't planned to be that way. I ruptured my Achilles tendon, and so I got surgery. And I was supposed to leave earlier, but they kept me here for longer. So that's why I'm here with a special place. But hope it's okay. So happy to be
This
with
is
you.
real commitment, Pascal. Thank you for making it work.
With pleasure.
All right. Before we start, I'd like to briefly announce a little bit about Matt for those of you who are joining and are not familiar with his work. Matt is an associate at the Oxford University and also a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace at the moment. And he's previously served as special advisor to really a broad variety of UN special envoys in a lot of different contexts, conflict contexts that are quite complex and complicated. For instance, he was in Afghanistan, in Syria, Somalia, and in Yemen. And he has also undertaken quite a bit of research as a fellow at the program on negotiation at the Harvard University, at the Harvard Law School, and also several other distinguished universities. And I think what makes it so interesting to have him here with us today is this background of scholar practitioner. So really he can really combine both worlds and has worked in both fields. So before we really look into the structure of the paper, etc., Matt, why did you actually undertake this research and write this paper? What was your key motivation? And maybe also tell us a little bit about the methodology and the setup that you used.
Sure, happy to do that. I mean, the motivation was very simple, really, which is that, as everyone recognizes, the world is plagued by armed conflict. In fact, more armed conflicts than at any point since the end of the Second World War. And the devastation, the destruction, the suffering that they cause. And I feel, as a mediator and someone working in the mediation world, a really heavy responsibility to try to put my mind to the question of how we could do better in trying to prevent those conflicts, how do we could seek to mitigate and ultimately resolve them. So it was about, very personally for me, what we could do to be more effective. Yeah, I'm very concerned about the future, and I feel that the field really needs to be geared to tackle some enormous challenges. Hence the work that I undertook, which was really focused on one single question, which is what can we do? What needs to change for us to improve, to achieve better results? And I posed that question to 86 of some of the most experienced and talented mediators. I used a snowball technique, so I started with a small group of people who are distinguished and very highly regarded, and then used their referrals to engage with others. And I really found that question opened up just an extraordinary reservoir of ideas, of insights and responses, which I found tremendously valuable. Many of these people have decades of experience, so that was the methodology for me then listening and trying to discern from their responses what it was that could change for us to do better. I supplemented those interviews with 10 colloquia, which were organized by or sponsored by different organizations such as USIP or Oxford University or FBA, where we were looking at overall questions of mediation effectiveness or drilling down on specific issues, again with a different group of individuals to try and ensure that I was reaching out to as many in our field as I could and testing some of the emerging findings of the research.
Yeah, I think it's quite unusual that you were able to bring so many voices into one piece of research, and also to have these quite frank looks and impressions on some of the major flaws, because ultimately it's a really big self-critique, which is not something that is easy, I think, to do. The structure of the paper is really interesting, I find, because you obviously position peacemaking and mediation in the current context and look at some of the challenges, sort of the complexity of the conflicts and the way conflicts have changed, the international division that is increasing, and also sort of the liberal decline of states, and ultimately also sort of a lack of international will to be really involved in long-term mediation processes. And I think what's really interesting for us today is maybe to look also at your second part of the paper, which you name the flaws, deficiencies, and propositions, and look at what goes wrong in contemporary peacemaking, but also look at how could it be done better. Because it's quite easy, right, to point the finger on what goes wrong, and it's a lot harder to have a very concrete suggestion on how it could look different. So if you wanted to walk us through, some of the structural failings that you've noticed, some of the key points that were taken up by all respondents, actually, and then see what some of the things are that could change for the better.
Sure. Well, just to step back then and give you some of the key headlines. I mean, I think all of the interviewees I engaged with recognize that there is some extraordinary work being undertaken by mediators in recent years, and of course today, much of which is unsung, given the need for confidentiality. So that I think is clear, the recognition of the value of mediation work and how it has the potential to really transform situations when conditions are right and when the engagement is handled well. But at the same time, there was also recognition that the circumstances mediators are working in are tremendously difficult at this stage. For all the reasons we're aware of, as you said, the international division, the complexity of conflict, transnational dynamics, the way in which we've seen rising interventionism by regional and major powers in civil wars. We've seen a whole range of factors which make mediation work in this era extremely difficult. And everyone, I think, wanted to recognize that, and to acknowledge that mediation work under any circumstances is usually extremely difficult because of the power of the drivers of conflict. Set against that, I found that virtually everybody I spoke to wanted to bring attention to things that were going wrong or being handled badly. And of course, I'd asked a forward-leaning question: what needs to change essentially for us to enhance efficacy? But people wanted to talk about what's going on, and the paper is very much structured around their responses to that. And they point to flaws and deficiencies in systems, structures, policies, and practices. And just, I mean, there are many, but I did my best to try to convey what I was hearing. And indeed, as you say, I've really tried to accompany the reader to allow them to listen to and hear mediators as they speak non-attributively. So they therefore were speaking very openly and honestly about the problems within the field of mediation, and hence there's long quotations so that the readers could really sense what those issues were, and there are many, but just to give you a sense of it, the view that and of course this is very much an abbreviation of what I heard, but that too much was trying to be achieved within very short time frames. The view almost universally held that we need to take the time because these things cannot be rushed. There are no shortcuts and quick fixes to really sustainable mediation efforts. The concern about structures that you mentioned, the concern about over-centralization and bureaucracy, especially within the UN and certain other organizations, and a self-absorption about us rather than the goals and the people who are suffering from conflict. People raised with me concerns that some teams didn't have mediators with genuine mediation experience, or lacked individuals with knowledge and experience in other relevant areas like peace building and reconciliation. People shared experience of working on conflicts where there was a lack of knowledge of the local context. And of course, concerns about method. So that here, and I think this is very much reflecting contemporary concerns that agreements are being put ahead of relationships, and the dangers of reaching agreements which are not enduring because there isn't real buy-in. You haven't got the relationships there to sustain it, and there isn't real buy-in to what has been agreed. And certainly one can think of the recent developments in the Middle East in relation to Gaza or present on Ukraine. Is there a process which builds relationships so that parties can manage their differences peacefully, and do they buy in to those processes? And I think real questions about that, and a number of other areas, such as on prevention, implementation, concerns that we don't learn enough from mediation experience. Yeah, and I've tried to convey those as best I can in the paper. Writ large, I think people really very concerned that there are a number of flaws and deficiencies in quite fundamental areas. Do we know enough about the context we're operating in? To give that as an example, do we have the right people leading mediation efforts? Do they always have the mediation experience that we would like to see? These sorts of issues. So quite fundamental. And that, of course, is a source of deep concern to me. If there are areas that we can address and can improve what we're doing, increasing the chances of making progress, surely we should be putting our minds to how we can set about that task.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because, as you said, what strikes me is that these are really huge deficiencies in a way, and they are really risking to undermine, mediation as an area of work in, overall. And I think it's important to distinguish maybe between those areas that we can change and that we can't change. And I think what we want to discuss a little bit like later on is sort of the geopolitical pressures that are hard to manage and that are external, so that are basically we have to manage them. It's very hard to influence them, versus some of the things that can change and that you pointed out. And I think what I really took from, your research is this concern around like the skill set and sort of the area of professionalization, and also questions around accountability, and how it can be that you have in other areas of mediation, you have standard bodies that do that work on accreditations, that work on certifications, that work on education, and you don't have that in the international domain to the same extent. And that concern is huge, because it really touches ultimately on credibility of, the mediator and the team. How do you see that from like looking at the different areas that you outlined just now in terms of challenges? Is that for you as well an area that you found really striking and that you feel like this is one of the areas that can also be tackled, or is this really also difficult to change?
Yes, and I do think that this is something that struck me quite forcefully, that there is concern about the overall levels of professionalization. And of course, the field has been professionalizing and continues to do so. And the fact that it does that, in a way which is evolutional, is quite impressive. I think there is clearly a recognition amongst practitioners that the field needs to adapt to new circumstances, and many are trying to put that into practice. So we've seen, diversification, we've seen diffusion, we've seen rising pragmatism. I think we've seen increasing emphasis on human centricity, as it were. So the sort of psychology of mediation and the human skills required. So mediation is changing, I think, and over time professionalizing. But is it at the speed that is necessary to be able to address some of the huge challenges that mediation currently faces and will face in the future? And that is where I think there is opinion, certainly there, that greater efforts could be made to achieve higher standards throughout the field. And of course, mediation may be an ancient practice, but it is a young field in its current form. That really emerged in the 90s under very different circumstances. And of course, it's striking that in any field of occupational importance, you find that there are professional bodies to try to foster and promote best practice, and to really ensure that the field is operating in a highly professional way in order to achieve the results it seeks, as well as to advocate for the interests of the field. And if you think of architecture or engineering or medicine, or even fields within the arts, they're almost universally, you will find organizations that are dedicated to that. In other words, trying to strengthen the collective standards and impact of the field. And for various reasons, that doesn't exist in any sort of systematic way in international mediation. And perhaps that's to do with the fact that it is a relatively young field. But I certainly feel that there is a pretty strong argument that there could be more systematic efforts to raise standards in the field, to promote best practice, to promote exchange between researchers and practitioners, to try to think together about how to handle some of the collective challenges. So one of which might be coordination and complementarity. Are we maximizing the potential to work together? And when you think about the emergence of non-Western mediation actors and how central they've been in recent mediation activities, it strikes me that it's going to be crucial to find a way of working with those actors who are associated with Western approaches to mediation, that these two groups can work well together. Is there sufficient, is there collective thinking about that? What about monitoring, evaluation, accountability, where there is real concern that we're behind many other fields and professions? There, I think, you could see how collective action, or, at least collective thinking about some of these challenges could be helpful. And as I said, I think, if in terms of policy and advocacy, I'm kind of shocked by how little the field comes together to speak out for the things that would protect the integrity and strength and health of our field. So take resourcing, when so many organizations don't have sufficient resourcing to be able to act, in a flexible, responsive and effective way, or they are overburdened with bureaucratic requirements, or have short-term requirements in terms of their deliverables. That, I think, is very problematic for their work, where the field could speak together about that. Also think of something quite different, which is about the conduct of states who say they're interested in mediated outcomes, but at the same time are supporting parties to armed conflict. And so I think the field could have a lot to say about what is good practice for states as they engage in the peace and conflict arena. And of course, one only needs to think about recent developments, let's say on Gaza or Ukraine, where the field could usefully contribute not in terms of highly controversial issues directly related to the day-to-day developments, but about overall approaches in terms of process, the professionalization of process and of the need for buy-in, for ownership, for things to be run well in order to achieve a sustainable outcome. And I think there's just many areas where actually coming together collectively could be helpful. I don't think this would lead to some sort of template that is universal, or anything that could be imposed on mediation organizations. That's not a field that is susceptible to that. But in terms of trying to raise standards of the field, trying to ensure effectiveness and defend the interests of the field, I think there's probably much that could be gained by it.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for giving us so much detail on in particular that aspect, because I do think also it's like a really crucial finding in your work. What I find difficult to manage is that it is a bit of a paradox, because it does remain a business in a way, and it has to be that way in a way. This is how the money comes in, this is how the system is built. And yet it really then, I think what you mentioned is the scarcity now, that really the over-militarization as well. And I mean, since your research, this has only become worse in terms of how much funding goes into conflict prevention and in actual peace building work. And the scarcity of this, rather than leading to a more collaborative effort, has ultimately the opposite effect, that people and organizations become a lot more protective over their work and over what they do. And to me, that is one of the major flaws of the system as well, is this overprotectiveness of the domain. And this combined with this, that of course, often it is confidential what is going on. And then a few very big players that dominate the field and are neither sharing information nor being very collaborative. And I think that is definitely one of the challenges and a paradox as well on how to resolve that, because as we know, confidentiality is a hugely important principle of any mediation and peace building work. looking a little bit more at the geopolitical pressures and also maybe some of the changes since you've worked on the research and written about it. How do you see geopolitical challenges either supporting some processes or really also making progress or making conflict resolution almost impossible? What are your thoughts?
Well, let me, if I may, respond to your first set of points, which I think I very much agree with. And I think there are, of course, benefits to competition. It's been shown that it is useful to have incentives for organizations to succeed. Let's accept that. However, I do think there are real concerns when it comes to motivations, if those are substantially at odds with the motivation of trying to prevent, mitigate, or resolve conflict. And we all know that much of this work is about burnishing credentials. And whether that's organizations or states or key individuals. We can accept this, it is part of our world, but we must ensure that that does not get in the way of effectiveness, because the suffering at this moment, right now, today, is sort of impossible to count. How many people who are directly affected by armed conflict or indirectly, let us not forget that, in so many ways, that we cannot let those other secondary considerations get in the way of us ensuring that we have the greatest possible impact we can. We know that there will always be barriers for us being able to make progress, always. But one of them should not be something that derives from our own motivations. Of course, we have to live in the world we're in, but I do think it is right that we, as a community, seek to ensure that best practice is widely understood and, to the extent possible, followed. And that doesn't mean to say that politicians don't have a role, or some of the non-Western mediation actors who, like many others, are motivated. It's not to say that they don't have a really important role to play, but that we need to make sure accompanying those efforts are an acknowledgement of best practice and how that should be pursued. And the case of Ukraine, I think, is a good one, where it won't be enough to try to cut a deal, at the top, that is, something that is quickly accomplished without a deep appreciation of the underlying factors and the core interests and concerns of the parties. And nor will it be possible to do that without a process that is handled competently and professionally. That is in everybody's interests, actually, because we've seen the statistics. Let's not forget, that somewhere close to 40% of all agreements collapse or are undermined within 5 years. Now, if we want to do better, we need to ensure those elements of a process that we know can make a difference, that can contribute to sustainable outcomes, are taken into account. And just two of them, just to mention two of them, is building relationships and ensuring ownership of a process. That we've got to get those things right, and we're the environments we're operating in, we will be far from perfect. You know, this we have to manage in the circumstances we find ourselves, but we really must, I think, bring to bear some of the insights that we have from now several decades of work in this area, and to complement the more the newer efforts that we see by rising mediation actors whose work can be tremendously useful, I think, but it's going to require complementary efforts, in my view. You asked me about geopolitical changes, and that is something that I work on in my professional practice. And I think, yes, we are entering into a very difficult and dangerous era of international affairs. I think it may even be likely that we are entering into a new Cold War. And we should not forget that 6 or 7 times, at least in the last Cold War, we came within a hair's breadth of a nuclear exchange. So, this will be a very dangerous period, and where, of course, the central actors appear to be the United States, Russia, and China, but also with Europe, with Western Europe potentially having a very significant role in that future, rivalry and contestation. And I think it is incumbent on the mediation community to consider what, if anything, it can do to try to reduce the likelihood of a protracted period of hostility across multiple domains, and to do what it can to generate ideas that could be useful and could influence the powers, and see a way forward in diplomacy. As you mentioned, we have seen a rise in militarization and a belief that force, deterrence, and defense are the answers to the threats we face. That is understandable, but it must be accompanied by dialogue, diplomacy, and, I hope, mediation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this, this whole area of who are the actors, who are the emerging actors as well, be it organizations or states, I think it definitely deserves another deep dive as well, and that to look at their role and being quite pragmatic as well, and understanding they're not necessarily spoilers or a threat to conflict resolution, but what are the key drivers and what could they potentially actually achieve? So hopefully you're working on this, Matt, as a future topic. But before I go more into the maybe your vision for the future, I wanted to see with Pascal whether he had any more questions, more looking at the flaws and deficiencies in some of the areas we just talked about.
Thanks. Yes, I was actually wondering, Matt, where you see the main challenges. Because what you mentioned, the different different challenges, structures, over centralization, the actors, local knowledge, and so on, and then especially the competition one we discussed a few minutes ago. It's quite a systemic issue. So where do you think, at what level could we tackle this? Could we tackle this issue?
I think it's a really difficult question. And of course, partly, I think the answer lies with individual organizations. And I think that is happening on an incremental basis, where organizations are looking to try to improve the way that they are organized and the way they operate. And I think that is something that should be taken incredibly seriously, because there is so much to do. And I didn't find any one of my interviewees who said, oh, there's, I don't see any scope for improving or enhancing what I see in the organization I know best. I mean, that I didn't hear that from anyone. So there are areas, and there's a real acknowledgement of that, which I think is really healthy. And I think we should embrace it. I think the field has tended to be reticent to really dig deep in terms of where we're getting it wrong and how we can improve. And partly, of course, that's explained by the pressure on donors who want positive results that they want to present to their publics and for their politicians to use and so on. But it isn't healthy over the long term. I think we do need to be reflective, to consider it as actually something that we're obliged to do and that is a tremendously useful practice. Think of medicine if doctors hadn't thought about the practices of the past and whether they were actually producing the results they wanted, whether they were beneficial or not. No, surely that the right thing was for key thinkers and scientists to be questioning and asking what could we do better. That is what accompanies the most successful professions on the planet, and we should feel that it is right to do likewise. There's nothing, I don't think we should be afraid of that. That is something to be embraced. I worry, and I heard from many people saying that the UN, for example, is very defensive, that just wants to, bury bad news. No, bad news, think of the tech industry on the West Coast of America. Bad news, things that go wrong, can be really useful because you learn from them. So I think that kind of spirit, I think, could be tremendously useful for our field. And so I think, individual organizations can take that approach and a really rigorous approach to trying to think about what they're doing, how could they do it better, and whether it's, do the teams have the right people they need? Do they have the right skills? Are they sufficiently multidisciplinary? Could we benefit from people who are knowledgeable, let's say, of political economy or social science or psychology? But also then, for example, are the right methods being used? Are people thinking strategically? Are they starting with their ends and then, thinking backwards to how to achieve those goals? I think there's many ways in which we could, there's potential to improve for individual organizations. At the same time, as I just mentioned earlier, I think collectively we could be doing more together. And there are some efforts in that direction, the Mediation Support Network, the gatherings that we see convened by the EU, by Qatar. I mean, these are steps in the right direction, but that is somewhat different from a collective effort over time to really figure out where we are as a field, where we could enhance, our work. And I think that there will be resistance. You asked about challenges. There is resistance to that, and partly it's reputational reasons, and sometimes that comes down to individuals. It is difficult to speak critically of one's own organization or field, but I think we need to create that safe space where we can speak frankly and share thinking about what collectively we could do to do better. And that, I think, could be a really productive exercise.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you said. It really starts with documenting, I think, the lessons learned or the lessons not learned, right? And I remember at the time in Brussels with Mediateur, trying to support the EU in setting up a knowledge management system for conflict prevention and mediation work. And that wasn't all that easy because often it does have to do with confidentiality and with other issues. So it's like translating it into practice is ultimately really the challenge, I think. And similarly, what you said about the UN and the challenges connected to it, the feeling that it's such a bureaucratic, inflexible structure. I think there's a suggestion to streamline the organizational bureaucracy of the UN as well in the paper. Is this something sort of forward-looking? Do you feel that the current reform efforts, is that an opportunity to make sort of also the mediation work more flexible, or is it rather to the contrary, something where mediation will just basically totally fall out of the picture and not be talked about, and the focus is no longer there? What are your thoughts?
Well, my view of the United Nations is it is an organization that does conduct some important work in the sphere of mediation, but is nowhere near filling its potential. And nor is it fulfilling what I think was its central purpose when it was founded at the end of the Second World War, which was for the maintenance of international peace and security. Mediation and peacemaking should be front and center to United Nations work around the world. Now, the way I think it is developed is that the UN is doing a whole host of other very important initiatives and work in different areas, such as development, human rights, the environment, and health, and so on. Now, no one in their right minds thinks that those should be abandoned, but it doesn't mean that mediation work can be relegated to a sort of subsidiary undertaking that is peripheral to the UN's efforts. Now, it needs to be front and center. And I think we've seen a lack of high-level political commitment to that. It really is incumbent on the leaders of the UN and the states that engage at the highest levels to give the UN, to encourage the UN to do that, and the UN leaders to be proactive in that space. Of course, I recognize that it is an area where there is reputational risk. Why? Because peacemaking efforts usually fail, but that does not mean they are not worthwhile. I believe that the Summit of the Future endorsed the UN taking proactive measures, whether or not the UN Security Council has explicitly established a mission to advance mediation in a given place. It has endorsed the UN's efforts for to use good offices, to promote dialogue, to support diplomatic efforts, to prevent and resolve armed conflict. And the UN has got to step up because the world is in such a perilous state. We are moving into I believe, an era of great peril. And the mediation organizations below the level of the UN can contribute to mitigating those risks, but the UN will also be needed, and needed as I'm hopefully suggesting at a level of geopolitics between states, but also then within states to work on the many internationalized civil wars that the world has witnessed. I think there is a lot that the UN can do. It does need to reduce the regulation, the bureaucracy, the self-absorption, the rivalries within the organization. These things get in the way of one thing that should be the focus, which is impact. There's only one question that really matters, which is what effect is the UN having on the issues it is working on? Is it able not only to help mitigate conflict, but prevent it, and to help the parties to move towards resolution of armed conflict? I think there's much more that can be done.
That is really a strong appeal, Matt. So thank you for being quite bold as well, and critical and forward-looking too. Is there any other appeal you would like to give to people listening, so like a broad variety of practitioners, researchers, sometimes also in the beginning of their professional lives. What is it that you'd like to sort of tell them that what do we need now to change what we can change?
Yes, I would say that, of course, we need individual organizations to scrutinize where they can improve their practice. That's necessary. Is my view, we also need a collective process of change. Most fields have been through such processes. Think of humanitarian affairs or peacekeeping or peace building, and they're never easy to manage, and they're always difficult. And there are diverse views on a range of issues. There is rarely a clear pathway ahead. But I believe it is time for international mediation to for the actors operating in that space to try to come together and see whether we can establish a process which studies where is it that we might be getting things wrong and how can we improve? How ultimately can we raise standards right throughout the field?
You're muted. Okay. Sorry, I didn't hear you for a moment.
Yeah, and I think that we there is change underway right now in the field of mediation, and it's through socialization, experimentation, demonstration, and then observation and learning, and it has been reasonably effective in helping the field grow and develop. But the challenges are enormous. And I think there is much that could be gained by us coming together and trying to organize a process which could really catalyze and expedite change. And it's not as a substitute for evolutional change, it's to strengthen and accelerate that development. And I think a process that would be inclusive, that would really embrace the diversity of our field, both in terms of geography, but also then the very different approaches that are taken. I think it would in fact be diverse in terms of the disciplinary input that we would have, because we know that what we do is multidimensional. So we need people from the sister fields of peace building and diplomacy and reconciliation, transitional justice. We need people from other fields, from psychology, from social science, from political economy. And we need a process, I think, that prioritizes constructive engagement and which is well managed and which is focused on what can we do together as a field to improve our effectiveness. I think much could come out of that. I don't think it won't necessarily. I don't think there'll be easy answers. I don't think anything will be imposed on the field. It's not a field that it can be subjected to that. But we could, I think, potentially generate initiatives or even a professional organization of some kind that is looking to really get a grip on some of those flaws and deficiencies, which many believe exist, to tackle those collective challenges, and, as I mentioned earlier, to advocate for peacemaking at a time when militarization is seen as the best answers to the challenges and the threats we face. We need to protect and advocate for the value of dialogue, diplomacy, peacemaking, and ensure that those endeavors have a central place in managing world affairs and indeed individual and regional conflicts in the years ahead.
Thank you so much. That was a very powerful point to make in the end. I think in particular that you highlighted really opening the field of peace building and recognizing it for what it is, which is an interdisciplinary approach really, and that we should honor and celebrate that as well, which I think we're not doing enough. Pascal, I'm having an eye on the time as well. Are we coming to an end, or did you want to add anything?
No, thanks a lot. Being in the hospital, I was a bit less interactive today. I'm sorry for that, but I was extremely passionate, Matt. But I was just wondering, how can we, or also the listeners, how can you follow your work? What are the next steps? What do you plan? What's the way forward for your work?
What are next steps? And maybe also just to close, Matt, what gives you hope today as we talk?
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, I think I can be followed on LinkedIn, I suppose. I do continue to undertake research on mediation effectiveness. I'm also looking into the paradoxes of peacemaking, which I think can maybe help unlock some of our thinking about what is effective. But really, what I would most like is for practitioners and others to be applying their minds to these issues and thinking, as we try to do in our practice, really creatively about that question. What is it that we could change that would give us a better chance of having the impact that we're looking for? And for us to be, having that in our minds almost on a daily basis, and being willing to speak openly and honestly about that, because I think that kind of spirit together, combined with a sense of urgency, I think that would put us in a very strong position to identify those ideas that really could make a difference. And I really hope that people will say, I'm not just operating within, I'm not just going to talk to my colleagues in my organization. I'm going to reach out and not just meet them at a conference and have a conversation, but think about initiatives that can be taken across organizations, and maybe even involving those within states or within the new non-Western mediation actors. I think that can be much gained by collaboration, exchange, and a commitment to improve. That I think is well worth our time and effort. And you asked me what gives me hope, and I think it is the field itself, because no matter what I've shared in the course of this podcast, I have seen the most extraordinary change being enabled, supported, and sometimes spearheaded by mediators. We can all think of those cases where quite extraordinary change has been brought about that has led to just a vast difference to the lives of so many. And that has taken great skill, great dedication, and often I think out of the limelight. And I know that today in countries around the world, mediators with great talent will be applying themselves to conflicts to do what they can, and that's where there is hope. So the talent is there, the skill is there, there is experience. That gives me hope. My call is for us to let us seek to amplify our impact, to draw on that reservoir of capability and potential so that we really can maximize our impact.
Thank you so much, Matt. Absolutely. I mean, this was a proper appeal. I hope we will all, come together and try to translate this into practice, what you found and your vision for mediation peacemaking in the future. Just to say that this specific paper that we discussed today is available on the Howard Kennedy School and the Balfour Center. So for those of you who have not read it yet, please have a look at it. It's an absolutely worthwhile read. Thank you so much again for making the time again today, Matt. And we'll be, as you said, you can be found on LinkedIn. We'll be continuing to be active on LinkedIn and also post a follow-up to this podcast. So you look out.
Thank you so much.
Matt. Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.